Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. For today's bonus episode, I've asked theatre professional and author Nick Bromley to come and talk about his book Theatre Lore. As you will hear, Nick has had a long career in theatre as a stage manager and as company stage manager, where he has worked on UK tours and many London West End shows. Taking years of acquired knowledge, he then created a dictionary of terms, facts, myths and stories associated with the theatre, ranging in time from Aeschylus to Andrew Lloyd Webber, and alphabetically from Abelard and Eloise to Zorro. It's all done from a place of practical experience and love of the art, and with a very humorous eye on the subject. You wouldn't normally read a dictionary from end to end, but I did, and I was certainly educated and entertained in the process. But before we spoke about theatre lore, I asked Nick to tell me about his career in theatre, which started in the early 1960s and continues to this day. So he has seen too many changes to count and can remember a time when theatrical life was both very different and yet alarmingly similar to the way it still is today. So here is a first-hand account of a backstage life, which might also just answer some of those questions which, like me, you probably have about how things work and worked behind the scenery.
I'm going to go back to the beginning. My name is Nick Bromley, and I joined the theatre professionally now this is going to upset several of your listeners who probably don't believe there was an earlier century, but this was in about 1964. Yes, it was. It was earlier, 63. I decided to go into the theatre and become a stage manager. That was the purpose. So I joined the Central School of Speech and Drama, which had a technical course, and we did that for 2 years. But my first job was with Richmond Theatre, which in Surrey, which at the time was a weekly rep, which was very interesting. And I worked as a stagehand there. Then, having managed to not be expelled from Central and clutching a small certificate, I joined Equity, which you had to do in those days because it was a closed shop, and went on, got my first job, which was almost guaranteed because it was a much smaller profession in those days. There were far fewer people especially backstage. There were always people who wanted to act, but there wasn't this profusion of actors there is today, or, for that matter, the amount of work which television has brought about. So, sadly, rather than theatre. So my first job, in fact, was at the Malvern Festival Theatre, which had reopened after a hiatus brought on by the war. And Malvern was a very interesting venue in the 30s and 20s because it was where the plays of Bernard Shaw were often first produced.
Right.
And Barry Jackson from Birmingham ran it then, the Malvern Festival Theatre, and they thought they'd revive it, and they did. And in honour of Shaw, we did You Never Can Tell, and also J.B. Priestley, of course, was associated with Malvern, so we did An Inspector Calls and another play of his, and a couple of other plays as well. And then from there, and the thing is that when you joined Equity, which was, of course, it was a closed shop, as I think I've said already, you had to work. You had to do 26 weeks out of town before you could work in London. You had to, each week counted as a sort of stamp. They stamp the weeks. So I couldn't get a job in London, or knew how to at the time. But I saw an ad for an ASM needed for the tour of My Fair Lady, which had just finished. This is in 1965, and it had just finished at the Drury Lane. And it had been such a successful show that they'd sent out 2 versions or 2 productions at the same time. And I was with what was called the National Tour. Tony Britton was Professor Higgins, wonderful Higgins. And I joined them up in Newcastle, and for about a year and a half, and carried on with it. But it was a wonderful experience because it took me all around the country, and on a big musical, and it was a very large scale production, and it gave me invaluable knowledge, as it were. From there, of course, it'd been put out by HM Tennants. HM Tennants asked if I'd come and ASM in London, because I had my full equity ticket, as it were. And I joined a production of The Rivals at the Haymarket Theatre with Sir Ralph Richardson and Margaret Rutherford. And that brought me to London. After that, there was another show called Cactus Flower, which Tony Britton again and Margaret Leighton were in. And then after that, I thought that it was time for me to try and move on, but it was terribly difficult because ASMs, or assistant stage managers, were quite often, you'd meet them, they'd be quite often in their 50s or 60s because the openings weren't there to progress up. You became a deputy stage manager or an ASM, and you usually stayed that way for your career. And I didn't really want to carry on as an ASM. So I answered an advert in The Stage, which was for a stage manager to go out to South Africa. And I went out and joined a company called Tureen and Rubin, who put on shows all round the Cape and in Natal and in the Orange Free State and up to Pretoria and Johannesburg. And that again was invaluable because we did, I think it was 2 years, did about 16 shows, ranging from plays to review to music hall to musicals. So it was a terrific experience.
Yeah, that must have been a real adventure to travel that far in those days.
Oh, it was. I mean, it really was. Because the thing was, I was totally on my own, and quite often, literally, with a company. And so you'd have a touring company, and there'd be me, and possibly a mate or two who I found said, quickly come and be an ASM, come and help on this show. Like Françoise Hardy came out with and topped a variety show, and Shelley Berman and people like that. And you'd arrive on the Monday and get in to these theatres and open on Monday night. So there wasn't much time for subtlety. You put the lights up and you whacked it on and hoped the audience didn't see any of the mistakes, which obviously happened.
Which, as I understand it, is exactly what the ASM and the DSM are there for, to make sure everything happens like it should.
Exactly. I mean, their job is, to be serious, the ranking order, you start off as an ASM, an assistant stage manager, then you become, if you want to, a deputy stage manager. And the deputy stage manager is the person who calls for show, i.e. they sit in the prompt corner, they press all the buttons, they get the actors, they call the actors to the stage, they communicate with the sound and with the lighting departments as to when and where the lights come up, and if necessary, when the actors have forgotten their lines, which does happen, you have to prompt. Not an enviable job, because some actors hate it, or others continually wish to have a prompt. So it's feast or famine.
And you must have to know the show really well while you're concentrating on other things as well as checking where you are in the script. Yes,
your eye has to be on the script, and a script is opened up, and you've got the dialogue on the left, and on the right hand side you have the corresponding cues when they come up, and or effects or entrances, exits, anything special which happens in the show, all the technical aspects of it. Yeah.
So although they're often, I think, considered as people who do the lowest of the low jobs, in some ways, they are actually the linchpins of making the whole show run smoothly.
Oh yes, yeah. Absolutely. Unless you have a proper stage management team, shows would disintegrate. It would be like the play that goes wrong, but only for real. If you know what I mean. They can, I mean, and a bad stage management team could completely ruin a show, and that does happen occasionally.
And I guess it got even just more complicated in recent years, where shows have got so technical.
Yes.
And they rely on things like very quick and complicated scene changes and the like, costume changes as well, no doubt. So that must mean the team has got bigger in the stage management area.
And it's also diversified, because you have, for example, on a musical, you'll probably have an automation department these days, because so much scenery is moved by automation. This is a practical aspect of theatre, because if you can automate a set, you cut down on the staff you need. Whereas in the olden days, you had to have, big backstage crews to shift very heavy scenery. If it can be automated, put on a truck and moved by the press of a button, you're saving hundreds of, thousands of pounds on a production. It's all to do with cost. Yeah. Everyone says, theatre is, wonderful, but deep down, its success is dictated, apart from, a good script. It's dictated by how you can mount one sufficiently to make it feasibly economically. Yes. If that makes sense.
Yes, a pretty complicated calculation that must be.
It has to be very carefully worked out. I mean, spontaneity is the least thing which happens when creating a stage show.
Yeah,
everything has to be worked out in advance and very carefully worked out. Not only the direction, but the mounting of the show, the design of a set, the costing of it, which a production manager has to. That's where he earns his money.
And of course, you made it back from South Africa and have been involved in some really big London West End shows over the years.
Yeah, I'm very, very luckily. Just before I left South Africa, I was working for a very short time, because they knew I was going away, on a production of the Boyfriend.
Yes.
For Michael Codron Limited. In those days, Michael Codron was, and still is, one of the most important London theatrical producers, English producers. We had for straight plays, comedies, dramas, tragedies, if you like. Not really for musicals, but Michael had done. He did do the Boyfriend, which was very successful. It was a revival. Was very successful. Cheryl Kennedy playing Polly. Anyway, after that, then Michael had so many shows coming in that I worked for him for about 8 years, which was a terrific experience. And,
so you're moving around the different London West End theatres as shows come and go.
Different theatres here, there, and everywhere. Yes, and then in the early 80s, I took a couple of years out to take a breather, because it's hard work. You join a show, and in those days it was quite often run of contract, run of play. Your contract meant that you signed up for the duration. You could get out of a play, but then that was generally to go and do another long run. So you worked, you earned your money because you worked for if it was a success, for a minimum of 12 months before you could possibly leave, or even 15 months. So I was a bit tired of every single, working every single week, as it were. So I took time out and went into conferences for a bit, but I didn't really like conferences. I liked the shows themselves, the creation of them, and the content, of course, because I'd been lucky during these years to have worked with people like Alan Ayckbourn and playwrights of that caliber, which was wonderful. And then when I came back into the theatre, I decided, well, no one else would really. Apart from what I was doing, I thought it was probably easier to get a job doing what I knew. I was lucky enough to get onto a show called apart from a few shows, and then the Pirates of Penzance came up, which Michael White put on at Drury Lane. And it was slightly revolutionary because it was a Joe Papp production, his production, which has been in the park in New York. Yeah. And what was revolutionary was that the copyright to Gilbert and Sullivan had come to an end, as it were. And therefore he was able to Joe Papp was able to re-orchestrate the music, which he did. And so the score was, I won't say jazzed up, it was bounced up, and very successfully too. So we had Tim Curry as the Pirate King, and it was a superb production, and still, you know, talked of to this day. And that led me into the world of musicals, which I hadn't done for about 10 years. And led on to various other musicals like Starlight Express and Crazy for You and Damn Yankees with Jerry Lewis and Grease and Saturday Night Fever and things like that. King and I, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, Woman in White, and then onwards and upwards.
Right, that hardly sounds like upwards anywhere from there. That's a fine list of productions. Especially Starlight Express, that must have been an interesting one.
I was company manager. So on musicals, during my play period, as it were, I was company stage manager. But from the time I started from musicals, they had realized by then, because musicals were getting more complicated, bigger, with more machinery, more things go wrong. A stage manager could not combine the role of company manager. So, which was a blessing, I think, because I wasn't a particularly good stage manager, and wonderfully organized, and I wasn't wonderfully organized, but I could do the company management job, I believe, quite well. And so I stayed as a company manager from there on, up until today. Yes.
Still, yes, you are still working, we should say. I mean, you've just proved you have a fantastic memory for everything that you've done. And off the back of all that, I guess, you wrote a book. Or rather, I should say, you compiled a dictionary.
Yes, you're absolutely right. This was this came about because over the years I'm a great book collector, and I pick up books on theatre, on history, or whatever subject interests me. And I'd come across one or two books on technical terms for professionals, and they were pretty dry. And I thought it might be quite fun to put together a dictionary of using the terms and the phrases which are used in the theatre, and put a slant to them and make them entertaining, but try and keep on the ones which are true, the truth about the terminology, about what they meant. So I suppose that's the best way to describe them.
Yes, I should say you called the book Theatre Law, but yes. The subtitle is A Dictionary of Backstage Language, Expressions and Useful Stage Knowledge for Those Theatrically Bent or of a Curious Nature. Now, I think that covers probably most people who listen to this podcast, so we're on firm ground here. Yeah. And I have to say, it is definitely not a dry dictionary. It's got some lovely cartoons in it by Simon Bond as well, which only augment your slightly tongue-in-cheek at times entries. Yes. And you certainly show off some of your deep knowledge about the way theatre works.
Yes, what they don't see, what people don't see, you see, when they're sitting in their seats in F4 in the stalls.
Indeed.
And I mean, some of the terminology is slightly invented, but all the theatrical terms are for real, and I hope explained in an entertaining way. Is that the best way to put it? I don't know.
I think so. Yes, very entertaining, and you make the point that it's of a size where you can slip it into your pocket and take it with you on the train. And we're not talking about the Oxford English Dictionary here. We're talking about a very readable and a goodly sized book. Which covers different sorts of entries as well. I mean, you do have the absolute technical terms for some things, but also there's a bit of history in there, and a bit of some sideways glances, shall we say, at some of the things that happen in theatres. I mean, there were some entries I particularly liked. The ones on about the actors' digs, which of course is such a classic subject, I guess, for actors to be discussing, and it goes back into the days of weekly rep theatre and the like, where actors were travelling around, and it sounds like some of the accommodation that they were put into was pretty terrible.
Appalling, absolutely appalling, because you'd phone up for now what's happened nowadays is that digs have disappeared, but back in the days in the 1960s, 1970s, and it began to fade out in the 80s, there'd been digs for 100 years, and they were run usually by pretty formidable ladies who would make a bit on the side from letting out their spare room or rooms to actors. And some became very professional about it. They'd give you a boiled egg at breakfast, very professional. And they'd change the sheets, possibly once a week. That's if you hadn't burnt them, because most sheets in those days were nylon. And so if you smoked in bed and dropped a bit of ash, which used to happen, suddenly there'd be an enormous hole in your sheet. And the only way to get away with not paying for it at the end of without her finding, was to have to change the sheet round so the hole was where your feet are rather than up where your head was and been sitting on the pillow.
We won't mention any names, and they're probably not with us anymore.
No. No, they're all gone. They've all gone. Yes. I mean, so, there was a deputy stage manager I knew. I mean, he must have gone too, but he started off the tour with 3 suitcases, and as the tour carried on, the suitcases disappeared one by one, and we couldn't work this out. And he'd always ask, when we did the get out, which is when you took the set down at the end of the end of the run, whether he could leave early, because a get out could take 12 hours, depending on the size, up to 12 hours, depending on the size of the show which you were getting out. I mean, usually not. It was usually for a straight play. You'd be out by 1 or 2 at the latest. But he'd say, I'd like to leave now so I can go ahead and be fresh for the get-in. That's when the set arrives at the next day. So we said, that was fine. We didn't mind, it meant we got there later. We could take a later train to the next port of call. And eventually we got towards the end of this tour, and he only had a paper bag, a big paper bag with his clothes in. What's happened to him? And then we discovered that he'd got into such trouble, such money trouble. He would go back to his digs, and he would have to leave his suitcase in the room, because he couldn't leave through the front door on the morning of the out. He'd have to climb out of the window and hightail it to the station. So he usually took a ground floor room. As far as I know, he never injured his feet, jumping from a higher level.
And the bad reputation of theatrical people is maintained yet again.
Oh yes, history. Oh yes. I mean, it can be a very badly behaved profession. There's no doubt about it.
And you say the actors' digs really don't exist anymore.
Very few now. It is a big problem. There was a thing about it quite recently in the stage, because the digs have disappeared. So and Airbnb has become the rage, but of course the poor old actors only get enough touring allowance probably to cover 2 nights at an Airbnb out of a week.
Right.
So it's the cost which has soared. And then the old people who used to, you could get a room in the old days for, £8, £10, and in the very old days, you could get a room for, my very first job, I was being paid £13 a week.
Right.
And with £13 a week, I could eat. Okay, this is in 1965. You could eat, you could take a room for a week, you could have a drink, and you could put a couple of quid away for income tax, which you were paid gross. Glory days, absolutely glory days.
Pretty unimaginable now, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, impossible. Yeah, it's impossible. So a lot of people can't afford to go on tour, especially if if you've got a flat or house, mortgage, alimony, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been a lifestyle choice, hasn't it, being a touring actor? But it just gets harder and harder. And it always strikes me that tours seem to go around the country in the most illogical way that they can possibly create. Because one day they're in Glasgow, and then 2 days later they're meant to be in Southampton. Or
yes, the art of booking a tour can go slightly wrong.
And presumably that just comes down to what space is available when, and you're forced into moving around in that manner.
At the time, yes. And what you don't want to do is have what you call a dark week. So say you're in Aberdeen and you're going maybe to Newcastle, yes, but you can't get to Newcastle immediately after Aberdeen, which that's a move which isn't too outlandish. 150 miles, so that's all right. But maybe there's Bournemouth is available, somewhere like that. But to go from Aberdeen to Bournemouth and then come back to Newcastle is ridiculous. So the only thing you can do in that instance is to have a dark week for the cast, and but you've still got to pay. I suppose some managements take it out as a holiday week. They say this is your holiday week, depending on how long the tour is. But you can't do that very often, and so you've got to pay them something not to work. And of course, there's nothing coming in. Yeah.
I mean, we're laughing about this now, but it is actually a very serious problem, and touring theatre is on its knees at the moment in England, isn't it? It's
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, theatre in general is on its knees. I think in many parts of the country, it really, people are having a very hard time.
Yes,
COVID was a terrible blow. It put people off going, and then the next crises which have come up, the cost of fuel, the fuel prices, and everything else, and just the cost of living has made people very wary of going out these days. In the end, so the whole of the entertainment business is suffering because of it.
So let's dip back in time a bit just to try and cheer ourselves up. I was also particularly grabbed by your entry about David Garrick. So perhaps I'll chat about that one as well as an example of what's in the book. Because he was quite a character and not someone I've talked about on the podcast yet, but we will get to him all in good time.
Yes, David Garrick. Now, David Garrick, one of my heroes. I mean, the first, not the first, but the most famous most famous actor of the 18th century. He sprang to fame with his performance as Richard III. He was the son he came from Huguenot stock, and his father was a wine merchant in Lichfield, and he went to the same school as Samuel Johnson, funnily enough. Yeah, they were friends, lifelong friends. And he came to London and decided he wanted to become an actor, and managed to get his first job at a theatre to explain that in the 1740s, in fact, throughout the 18th century, there were only three or up to 4 really legitimate theatres in London, which were there were 2 which were the royal patented theatres, which was Drury Lane and Covent Garden. And then you also had Lincoln's Inn Field, because the patent didn't go with the theatre, it went with the people who owned the patent or the patent. So it did move around a bit. And then you had the Opera House, you had the King's Opera House in the Haymarket, and you had the Little Theatre in the Haymarket. And Garrick, after his Goodwin's Field was his first show, he was an overnight success. Everyone talked about his performance. It was as magnetic as one which had preceded it by about 2 years, which was Macklin's Shylock. And Macklin's Shylock was the first attempt to show the character not as a grotesque comic person, but as a tragic figure. Garrick got into good company and found a way of getting the license for the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, which was on in a bad way. And his reign started there, and it carried on to about 1771. And he was enormously successful at Drury Lane, but he had all sorts of problems because it was a very rumbustious period, as you know. The 18th century London theatre was very rumbustious. And he suffered the slings and arrows of the audience. Well, not, they didn't actually fire them at him, but there were riots, there were ticket riots, so he put the price up. There was also whenever he brought a French company over, there was usually a riot because we were not particularly fond of the French in the 18th century. And it was a good excuse to cut loose and have a good old riot in the theatre, and throw people out. He had to often, the army were at times called out to quell the disturbances in the theatre. It was that bad. He brought over one show called The Chinese Festival, which was a ballet. There was a good deal of hissing, and they said, if I may quote, a good deal of hissing, noise, tumult, and commotion in the king's presence, who was in the royal box. His Majesty was amazed at the uproar, but being told that it was because people hated the French, he smiled and withdrew from a scene of confusion.
Yes, we worry about audience behaviour now, but when you read about through the history of theatre, audiences have been far worse behaved than we are.
Yes, oh yes. I mean, there's been some terrible occurrences. I mean, deaths have occurred because of people's bad behaviour in theatre. Sadler's Wells, several people were crushed to death because of a couple of drunks shouting out what people thought was fire. Because fire, of course, was the great fear of theatre owners up until, well, it still occurs today. I mean, I was involved in a fire which almost finished off the Cambridge Theatre back at the turn of the century. And despite all the precautions which have been put in since the Victorian era, but theatres regularly burnt down. I mean, Drury Lane burnt down twice. Yeah, very sadly, because a lot of people have died in infernos.
My thanks to Nick for taking the time out to talk to me. Although we ended on a rather down note there, thinking about fire and death in the theatre, his Dictionary of Theatre Law is a very entertaining and light-hearted read, which I think anyone with an interest or even half an interest in the theatre will enjoy. You can order it from your local bookshop or direct from Nick from his website, which is www.lnpbooks.co.uk. I've put a link in the show notes for this episode. If you were to order a copy direct from Nick, he'll sign it for you and make sure that it is carefully packaged to survive the rigours of the postal system and get to you in pristine condition. And Nick will be back in a few weeks' time for some more theatrical stories, this time with a distinctly spooky vibe. But next time, it's back to the Elizabethan playwrights, with a look at some of those who now only exist in the shadow of the greats, but who, in their time, produced some very popular plays and enjoyed a level of success and celebrity that tends to get forgotten. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group, or find us on Instagram or Twitter to keep up to date with the podcast and other theatre-related stuff. If you'd like to help support the podcast, the easiest thing would be to pass on the word to anyone you think might be interested in a bit of theatre history, or if you have a moment, write a review and rate the podcast on your podcast app of choice. You can find details of other ways to support the podcast at the website at www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. I look forward to your company next time, but if you have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can always contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via Twitter at thoetp.